Okay, in this video lesson, we're going to further our exploration with I. So we'll look at I raised to larger powers. In a previous lesson, we saw that I to the 0 was equal to 1 because any number other than 0 raised to the 0 is 1. We saw that I to the first power was equal to the square root of -1. I squared we saw was -1, and I to the third power was negative square root of -1. And in that previous lesson, we discovered that if we did I to the fourth took us back to 1. So there was this cycle of numbers. So what I'll do here is I'll list the 4 different answers we came up with. The only answers we ever got were 1, the square root of -1, -1, and negative square root of -1. And what I will begin to do is list the different exponents, meaning this. When we did I to the 0, we got 1. When we did I to the first power, we got square root -1. I to the second power, -1, and I to the third power. So in green are my exponents. So if we filled in this chart and continued this sequence, that means I to the fourth, the answer is 1. I to the fifth, the answer is square root -1. I to the sixth, -1. I to the seventh, negative square root -1. So I'll continue to fill this out. This would be 8. This would be 9, meaning I to the ninth, I to the 10th, I to the 11th. I to the 11th would also be negative square root -1. Continuing, I to the 12th, I to the 13th, I to the 14th, I to the 15th. Last row, I to the 16th would equal 1, according to this sequence. I to the 17th would equal square root -1. I to the 18th, -1. And I to the 19th would equal negative square root -1. So we have this little table here to get us something to start with, to build upon. So what I want to do is this. See if we can find a strategy for taking any one of these exponents and helping us to determine the final answer. So let's start with I to the 15th. All right. If we notice, there's a sequence of 4 numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4. So let's look at taking 15 and simply dividing it by 4 and see if the answer helps us to determine this is what our answer should be. So I'm going to start to just use the calculator to help us determine this. So if I did 15 divided by 4, calculator says 3.75. 3.75. Well, 3.75 is the same thing as 3 3/4. So this 3 here lets us know it should be the same answer as right here. That's what these will correspond to. This basically says you went through the cycle 4 times. I'm sorry, 3 times, 3 complete revolutions, and you stopped on the third. So look at our table. 1, 2, 3 complete. Now you're left over. That means you're left with I to the third power. I to the third negative square root -1. That might have been a little confusing, so let's do a different way. Actually, we'll look at other numbers on this row here. Let's take 19. So according to this, we should be able to take 19 divided by 4, and our answer should tell us something about it being negative square root negative 1. So back to the calculator, 19 divided by 4. Again, the remainder, the part that's behind the decimal, 4.75. It said 4.75, which is the same thing as 4 3/4. So again, this 3 here lets us know, that's the same thing as I to the third. I'm going to take it one more level. If I did old school and said I to the 19th, that's the same thing as I to the 4th times I to the 4th times I to the 4th times I to the 4th, so that's 16, times I to the 3rd. 4, 8, 12, 16, 17, 18, 19. Well, I to the 4th is equal to 1 times 1 times 1 times 1 times whatever I to the 3rd is. I to the 3rd negative square root negative 1. Just to try to overemphasize how to interpret what the calculator is telling us. The calculator, we're only focused in on that part of it. 0.75 is the same thing as 3/4, which means it's only the 3 that we're focused on. Let's see if it still works for I to the 7th. I to the 7th means 7 divided by 4, still get the 0.75. So that means anytime we divide by 4 and we get 0.75, that means our final answer is the same as I to the 3rd negative square root negative 1. Let's look at some from the other columns. Let's say 9. I to the 9th. I to the 9th means we're simply doing 9 divided by 4. Calculator says 2.25. Well, we're doing what? I to the 9th. So we did 9 divided by 4. Calculator said 2.25, which is the same thing as 2 1/4. So we're just focusing right there. And 1 is the same thing as, which means I to the 1st is the square root of negative 1. So that means any one of these numbers in the row with the 9, when we divide by 4, the remainder will be 0.25. That's the part we're focusing in on. That'll let us know our answer is the square root of negative 1. So if we did in the, let's say, the 18th, I to the 18th, I to the 18th, 18 divided by 4, calculator says 4.5. Well, we're doing I to the 18th. We did 18 divided by 4. Calculator said 4.5. Well, 0.5 is obviously 1/2, but that's the same thing as 2/4. And because it's a 2, the exponent of 2, I squared, is negative 1. So we're beginning to see that we'll only have certain decimals when we divide. We saw here we have 0.75. Here we have 0.5. Here 0.25. And here there will not be a decimal. Technically, 0.0. Let's test it. Let's do 12. So 12 divided by 4, no remainder, 3. So that's letting us know we technically have 3.0, which means our answer would be the same thing as, so I to the 12th is the exact same thing as I to the 0, which in this case is simply 1. All right, so we'll do a couple sample problems. Let's do I to the, let's erase that, I to the 63. 63. So we go to our calculator. Let's clear this. 63 divided by 4. Decimal is 0.75, which means this is the same thing as I to the third. 0.75 to the third means our answer is negative square root negative 1. Let me change up my colors. Let's do a different one. I to the 109. To our calculator, 109 divided by 4. So we're always going to divide by 4. 27.25. So that's the part we're focusing in on, the 0.25. 0.25 is the same thing as 1/4. So that means I to the 109 is the same thing as I to the first, 1/4. And I to the first is the square root of negative 1. Let's do a different one. Hopefully you can start to see what's going on here. Let's do I to the 86. All right, to the calculator. That's clear. 86 divided by 4. Remainder is 0.5. 0.5 is the same thing as 2/4. So that's the same thing as I to the second. Because we saw over here, 0.5 is the same thing as 2/4. I to the second, which is negative 1. We'll do one last one. Let's change it up, purple. I to the 304, big number. All right, so what you don't want to be concerned about is how large this number is, because no matter what this number is, you're simply going to divide by 4. So what was it? That's clear. 304 divided by 4. Calculator says, 76. No remainder, no decimal. So that means it's technically 76.0. So that means this is the same thing as I to the 0. Any number except 0 raised to the 0 is 1. All right, if you have any questions, just post them.